Devon Larratt has changed his training style heavily over the course of his career. He went from being predominantly an inside puller to being predominantly an outside puller. This transformation took place over decades of arm wrestling. However, now in 2023, Devon Larratt is beginning to come full circle. He is once again training things like side pressure and cupping as a regular part of his routine. This video will cover Devon's recent change in his philosophy in regard to training, as well as the reason why Devon decided to change his strategy once again. But first, we need to explain Devon's training strategy up until this recent change. Throughout Devon's career, he has become more and more committed to gaining hand control. He began to care less and less about side pressure and cupping, and he cared more about rising and pronation. As long as he was controlling the high ground, he didn't care if his wrist was busted back or if he was in a full-blown king's move. And we saw this reflected in his training. Devon's training pretty much only consisted of rising through back pressure and pronation through back pressure. And this really became clear in his build-up for Levon. We saw so many videos of Devon doing thousands of these little pronation and rising exercises. And while we didn't really get to see whether or not Devon's theory worked against Levon, we did see that it apparently worked pretty well against Prudnik later on, as Devon became the undisputed champ in the 115 kilo category. Devon also defeated Sandra Settis incredibly easily, and it was obvious that there was no one that had a chance against him in that weight category. However, there was one major problem with Devon's strategy, and that problem was named Jerry Cadorette. Devon's strategy of taking hand control works perfectly against someone who relies on hand control to win. The problem is, Jerry Cadorette does not. So let's rewind a bit back to 2018 when Devon pulled Jerry. Devon's standard hand control based style is worthless in this match, and he knows it. However, Devon's hook press is good enough that he can defeat Jerry 3-2, although it wasn't very easy. So the flop press is a major problem for Devon's training style, right? Well, in theory, yes it was, but luckily for Devon, Jerry was the only guy who was a real flop presser for a long time. A few other people kinda had a decent flop press, but it was nothing like Jerry, who specialized in it. So Devon's training strategy of focusing primarily on hand control was banking on the fact that Jerry was the only real flop presser. Of course, no one else was gonna start to use such a cheesy move. For a few years, this did work out for Devon. Pretty much nobody else had a flop press that was as good as Jerry, or they at least were not showing it if they did have it. But then, Dave Chaffee versus Vitaly Laletin happened. Devon has always talked so highly of Vitaly. Vitaly is the tallest arm wrestler we've got at that level, and his ability to take hand control is like no other. He nearly cracked back Levon's wrist after all, but Dave Chaffee managed to defeat him with a flop press. And Dave doesn't even really have a flop press. Dave's flop looks so awkward and unrehearsed, but it still was able to defeat Vitaly. So now Devon's training style had two problems, named Jerry and Dave. But that still shouldn't be too big of a deal. Jerry isn't strong enough for Devon, and Dave's flop press looked so awkward, Devon can still beat both of those guys without too much of a problem. As long as some high-ranking European arm wrestler doesn't start flop pressing, we're good. Oh, well that's unfortunate. That doesn't matter. Devon can just keep dodging Hermes like he always has. Instead, he can have a match with Gennady.
I understand exactly massive drive, there is a pin from Gennady, quick pin.
Oh. I think this moment versus Gennady is the moment that really caused Devon to change his training style once again. The thing was that Devon absolutely dominated Gennady's hand and wrist. The battle of hand control just wasn't even close. In that first round where Gennady tried to win hand control, Devon just destroyed him. But as soon as Gennady started flopping, Devon didn't really have an answer for it. Devon's hand and wrist were completely overpowered, but his side pressure and hook power was nowhere near the same level. And on top of that, Gennady was not even the final boss. Hermes Gasparini was considered the number 2 ranked puller on the planet at this time, and he has a flop press that was probably gonna pin Levon. Now, Devon's training style is in some real trouble. So what did he do? He went back to his roots. As soon as Devon got back to Canada after losing to Gennady, we started to see him training more side pressure and general hooking pressures. Here we see Devon sparring in a position he doesn't normally use. Most of the time, we see Devon just sitting in that open top row position and slowly bleeding his opponents out in practice. But here we see Devon testing his frame just like he used to way back in the day. We also saw Devon upload this. First, we see Devon training a high cup multi-spinner. This lift is designed to mimic a high hook, so it is somewhat training his inside game, but it also relies on maintaining full hand control, so it's not a straight up inside lift. But after this, we see Devon using this exercise. This exercise is a combination of side pressure and supination. Now, Devon has trained supination in the past, but not like this. Notice how Devon is standing off on the corner of the table, and also notice how his body position is heavily angled. Although there is still a bit of back pressure, the vector Devon is hitting here is nearly straight up side pressure. And after this, we see Devon training the same thing with a multi-spinner. This time he commits his shoulder even further, to the extent that at this point he looks like he's doing a Todd Hutchings workout. He's training direct side pressure. And more recently, we have seen Devon training some more inside pressure. Here we see him doing a lift that is designed to mimic a press, and here we see him doing more high cup multi-spinner. Once again, Devon is hitting a ton of side pressure during this lift, way more side pressure than he has hit in the past few years. Additionally, this lift is a single. Devon really is training a lot like Todd Hutchings here, which is pretty hilarious. Now, it is important to clarify that Devon has by no means stopped his outside training. Devon's pronation, rising, and back pressure is stronger than it has ever been, according to Devon. So he has not given up on his strategy to take hand control above everything else. He has simply added inside arm wrestling back into his game. This way, once he takes hand control, his opponent does not have the option to flop press after this. Devon is simply plugging the holes that were beginning to sink the ship, and this is going to be 100% necessary for Devon at the moment. At the time of this video, Devon Larratt is going to be pulling Hermes Gasparini in just a few weeks. Not only does Hermes have an incredible hand and wrist and incredible back pressure, but Hermes might just have the best flop press in the world. If it worked on Levon, you would tend to assume that it will work on Devon. Devon will need a perfect performance against Hermes to have a chance. He needs to have every single option covered. He will have to first gain hand control from Hermes in order to take away Hermes' traditional options. And from there, Devon will need enough cupping and enough side pressure to block Hermes' flop press. If Devon is not strong enough to do any one of these steps, his entire game will collapse. Devon is attempting to bring himself fully back to fundamental arm wrestling, a version of himself that can do any technique he wants to at an elite level. This is reflected in his new training, and at this point, we are less than 1 month away from finding out whether or not he has succeeded.